This video looks at adaptations to the environment. In the video, we will look at several topics. First, we will look at habitats, communities, species, and populations, before moving on to how organisms adapt to the abiotic environment. Next, we will look at how abiotic variables can affect species distribution and how this can lead to a range of tolerance. The conditions for coral reef formation will then be discussed before we take a closer look at biomes and their distribution. Finally, we will look at how organisms can adapt to environments such as deserts and rainforests. Let's explore the relationships between habitats, species, populations, and communities, and how these concepts fit together in an ecosystem. Let's look at this simple pond ecosystem. You can see different organisms, plants, insects, and a bird, all interacting with their environment. This single diagram helps us understand four key ecological terms: habitat, species, population, and community. First, the habitat. A habitat is the place within an ecosystem where an organism is found. It includes all the biotic or living factors, like plants and prey, and the non-living factors, such as temperature, water, and sunlight. For example, this pond provides a habitat for aquatic plants, fish, and insects. Each species has its own specific habitat requirements. For instance, some may live near the water's surface, while others thrive at the muddy bottom. Next, we have a species, which is a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. The bird flying above the pond represents one species. Every species has adaptations that allow it to survive in its particular habitat, such as the bird's wings for flight or the frog's moist skin for life near water. A population is a group of organisms of the same species, living in the same area at the same time. For example, all the frogs in this pond make up one population. Populations can increase or decrease depending on factors like food availability, predation, and environmental changes. A community includes all the populations of different species living and interacting within an ecosystem. Here, the frogs, plants, fish, and insects all form part of the pond community. Communities are dynamic. Their structure can change due to migration, competition, or environmental conditions. Adaptations to the abiotic environment are how organisms survive and reproduce under different non-living or abiotic conditions. Take a look at the example shown here. Each plant has unique features that allow it to thrive in challenging environments, from dry deserts to waterlogged mangrove swamps. These are all examples of adaptations to abiotic or non-living factors, such as temperature, light, water, salinity, and oxygen availability. The key point here is simple. Organisms are adapted to survive and reproduce in the abiotic conditions of their specific habitats. Every plant or animal is shaped by the environment it lives in, whether that means coping with extreme heat, high salt, or low oxygen levels. Let's define two important terms. Adaptation is a feature, structural, physiological, or behavioral, that increases an organism's chance of survival and reproduction in its abiotic environment. For example, structural adaptations include physical features, like thick leaves or long roots. Physiological adaptations involve internal processes, such as salt excretion or water storage. And behavioral adaptations are actions or responses that improve survival, such as leaf rolling to reduce water loss. Abiotic refers to non-living environmental factors, things like temperature, light, water availability, salinity, pH, humidity, and oxygen concentration. These are the conditions that shape how and where organisms can live. Now let's look at some adaptations of plants in sand dunes and in mangroves. You should be able to describe and explain these in the exam. In dry environments such as sand dunes, plants may have extensive root systems or adventitious roots to reach deep water sources. They may also have rolled leaves and flexible stems, helping to reduce water loss and withstand strong winds. In contrast, trees that live in mangrove swamps often develop buttress roots to provide stability in soft, waterlogged soil, and pneumatophores, or air roots, to obtain oxygen when the soil is low in it. Some plants can even excrete excess salt from their leaves to survive in saline conditions. Here, we'll look at how non-living factors, such as temperature, light, and salinity, determine where species can live and how abundant they are. Let's define some important terms used in ecology. Species distribution refers to the geographical area where a species is found. The tolerance range is the range of an abiotic factor a species can survive in. The limiting factor is the abiotic condition that most restricts the distribution or abundance of a species. For example, temperature for coral reefs, or salinity for freshwater fish. The optimal range describes the conditions under which the species does best, while the zones of stress are conditions outside this optimum, where survival becomes difficult or impossible. Here is a tolerance curve, which shows the relationship between an environmental condition, temperature, and the abundance of a species. As you move along the x-axis, the environmental condition changes, and on the y-axis, you can see how the number of individuals in the population varies. In the middle of the graph is the optimal zone. This is where conditions are just right for the species, where it can grow, reproduce, and thrive. For example, fish species may have an optimal temperature range where they are most abundant and active. As conditions move away from the optimum, we reach the zones of stress. Here, the species can still survive, but growth and reproduction are reduced. Only a few individuals manage to persist under these stressful conditions. Eventually, if the environmental factor becomes too extreme, the species can no longer survive at all. That's beyond its tolerance range. A great example is coral reefs. Corals can only survive within a narrow temperature range, usually between 23 and 29 degrees Celsius. If ocean temperatures rise above this limit, corals experience stress, leading to bleaching and even death. This shows how powerful abiotic factors are in shaping species distribution. Now that we have looked at what range of tolerance is, let's see how environmental gradients and systematic sampling can be used to study how species respond to changing environmental conditions. Let's go through the key terms used in this type of field study. A transect is a line or belt across an environmental gradient used for systematic sampling. A gradient is a gradual change in an abiotic factor across space. For example, soil moisture decreasing with distance from a riverbank. Abundance means the number or percentage cover of individuals of a species in a sample area. And systematic sampling means taking samples at regular measured intervals along the transect. This ensures your data is consistent and representative. Here, you can see a transect laid out across an environmental gradient. Along this line, scientists measure both abiotic factors, like soil pH or light intensity, and the abundance of plant species. By studying how abundance changes along the gradient, we can estimate the range of tolerance for that species. The range of tolerance describes the range of an abiotic factor within which a species can survive. Outside of this range, the species becomes stressed or may not survive at all. By measuring how abundance changes along the gradient, we can identify the conditions that are optimal for growth and where stress begins to occur. For example, if you were investigating how soil pH affects plant growth, you might place pH sensors at intervals along your transect. At each point, you would count how many individuals of the same plant species are present. If abundance peaks at a pH of around 6.5, that would represent the species' optimum range, and as pH becomes more acidic or alkaline, the numbers would drop, showing the zones of stress and limits of tolerance. Coral reefs are among the most productive and biodiverse ecosystems on Earth, but they are also extremely sensitive to environmental change. They only form where abiotic conditions are ideal, where the water is warm, clear, and stable. Let's review the key terms needed to describe coral reef formation. Zooxanthellae, are photosynthetic algae that live symbiotically inside coral tissue. This relationship is an example of mutualism. Both organisms benefit, the algae gain protection and access to sunlight, while the coral receives nutrients from photosynthesis. Calcification refers to the deposition of calcium carbonate that forms the coral's hard skeleton. This process depends on warm, well-lit, and alkaline water conditions. Coral reefs form only when temperature, light, salinity, pH, and clarity are within narrow limits. If even one of these factors changes significantly, corals become stressed and may die, leading to reef degradation or coral bleaching. Regarding temperature and light conditions, corals thrive in tropical seas where temperatures stay between 23 and 29 degrees Celsius. They also need shallow, clear water, so sunlight can reach the photosynthetic algae that live inside their tissues, the zooxanthellae. Without sufficient light, these algae can't photosynthesize, and the coral loses its main energy source. Next, salinity and pH. Corals need seawater that's saline, around 34 to 37 parts per thousand, and a stable, slightly alkaline pH near 8. If the ocean becomes too fresh, too acidic, or fluctuates too much, coral growth slows and skeletons weaken. That's why coral reefs are rarely found near river mouths or in areas with heavy freshwater runoff. Finally, water clarity. Corals depend on clear water, so light can penetrate to their symbiotic algae. Sediment, pollution, or excess nutrients reduce clarity and can smother coral polyps, preventing photosynthesis and growth. This topic explains how temperature and precipitation, two key abiotic factors, determine where different terrestrial biomes are found around the world. Let's go over the key terms. A biome is a large region defined by its climate, vegetation, and adapted organisms. Precipitation refers to the amount of rainfall or moisture entering an ecosystem, and latitude describes the distance from the equator, which determines how much solar energy a location receives, and therefore its temperature. Take a look at this biome diagram, showing the relationship between average temperature on the x-axis and annual precipitation on the y-axis. Each biome, such as tropical rainforest, temperate forest, or desert, occupies a specific region on this graph, depending on the climate conditions that support its vegetation and organisms. The key point here is straightforward. Temperature and precipitation are the main abiotic factors that determine the global distribution of terrestrial biomes. Together, they shape the types of vegetation that grow and the animals that can survive in each region. Temperature is largely influenced by latitude, or distance from the equator. At the equator, solar radiation is strong and consistent throughout the year, producing warm temperatures that support lush tropical forests. As you move toward the poles, sunlight becomes weaker, temperatures drop, and biomes shift to temperate forests, taiga, and finally tundra, where conditions are too cold for most plant growth. The second factor is precipitation, the total amount of rainfall or moisture an ecosystem receives. Areas with high rainfall and warm temperatures form tropical rainforests, which support dense vegetation and high biodiversity. As precipitation decreases, we move through savannas and grasslands, and finally into deserts, where low rainfall limits plant growth almost entirely. If we trace the biomes on the graph, on the far left with low temperature and low precipitation, we find tundra and polar deserts. As temperature rises slightly and precipitation increases, boreal forest or taiga appear. In moderate conditions, temperate forests and grasslands dominate, and at high temperature and high rainfall, we reach tropical rainforests, the most productive terrestrial ecosystems. This distribution pattern demonstrates how abiotic conditions set the limits for life. A biome is a group of ecosystems that share the same abiotic conditions and, therefore, contain organisms with similar adaptations. This means that even though biomes may be found on opposite sides of the planet, they can still look and function in remarkably similar ways. Similar abiotic factors, such as rainfall, temperature, and soil type, lead to similar adaptations in species across different regions. Plants in dry areas often have waxy leaves or deep roots to prevent water loss, whether they're found in the Kalahari or the Mojave Desert. This shows how the environment shapes adaptation, even in unrelated species. This brings us to a fascinating concept: convergent evolution. It occurs when unrelated species evolve similar traits because they face similar environmental pressures. For example, cacti in the Americas and euphorbias in Africa both store water in thick, fleshy stems and have spines to reduce evaporation, yet they come from entirely different plant families. Their similarities are a result of adaptation to the same kind of dry, hot environment. To summarize, biomes are global-scale regions defined by climate, vegetation, and adapted organisms. Similar abiotic conditions produce similar ecological adaptations. And convergent evolution explains why species in different biomes can look and behave alike, even though they're unrelated. Plants and animals have evolved adaptations that enable them to survive and reproduce under very different abiotic conditions, from the hot, dry deserts to the warm, humid tropical rainforests. Let's start with deserts, where conditions are extremely hot, rainfall is minimal, and water conservation is essential. The cactus shown here demonstrates several structural adaptations for surviving arid environments. Leaves reduce to spines, which minimize water loss through transpiration and also provide protection from herbivores. A thick waxy cuticle on the outer surface, which reduces evaporation. And a pleated stem, allowing the plant to expand and store large volumes of water after rare rainfalls. Together, these features enable cacti to thrive where few other plants can survive. Now let's move to tropical rainforests, environments with high rainfall, warm temperatures, and dense vegetation. Here, animals face very different challenges, navigating complex vertical habitats and competing for food and space. This monkey shows several adaptations to rainforest life. A prehensile tail, which acts like a fifth limb for gripping branches. Forward-facing eyes, allowing depth perception and precise movement through the canopy. And opposable thumbs, which provide strong grasping ability for climbing and feeding. These adaptations improve agility, coordination, and survival in a crowded, three-dimensional environment. In this video, we covered several key points. Pause the video and read through them for a review of the topics covered.